The year was 1854. A territory called Kansas became a battlefield, not metaphorically, literally. Neighbor murdered neighbor over a single question: should slavery be legal? 200 died in 5 years of guerrilla warfare, political assassinations, and terrorist raids. This wasn't the Civil War. This was the dress rehearsal, and it proved the nation was already broken beyond repair. January 4, 1854. The U.S. Senate chamber in Washington. Senator Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois rose to introduce a bill that would tear the nation apart. He didn't intend to start a war. He was trying to build a railroad. Douglas was ambitious, brilliant, and convinced he could solve any political problem through compromise and deal-making. At 41, he was already a Senate powerhouse, chairman of the Committee on Territories, and a likely future president. His immediate goal was practical: organize the Nebraska Territory, the vast, unsettled region west of Missouri and Iowa, so a transcontinental railroad could be built through it. He wanted that railroad to run through Chicago, enriching Illinois and securing his political legacy. But there was a problem: slavery. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 had kept the fragile peace for 34 years. It had drawn a line across the Louisiana Purchase at 36 degrees 30 north latitude. Above the line, slavery prohibited. Below it, slavery permitted. Below it, slavery permitted. Missouri was admitted as a slave state. Maine is free, preserving the balance. The Nebraska Territory sat entirely above the 36 degrees 30 line. Under the Missouri Compromise, it should be free territory. But Douglas needed Southern support to pass his territorial organization bill, and Southern senators wouldn't support creating more free territory. The balance was already tipping against them: 15 free states to 15 slave states in 1850. But the North's population was growing faster. Every new free state threatened Southern political power. Douglas proposed a solution he called popular sovereignty. Let the settlers decide. When the territory applied for statehood, residents would vote on whether to permit slavery. It sounded democratic. Let the people choose. What could be more American? But it meant repealing the Missouri Compromise, tearing up the agreement that had prevented sectional conflict for a generation. Southern senators loved it. Here was a Democrat from Illinois, willing to open territory north of 36 degrees 30 to slavery. They demanded Douglas go further, split the Nebraska Territory into two, Kansas and Nebraska, giving slavery 2 chances instead of 1. Douglas agreed. He knew he was taking a risk, but he believed popular sovereignty could manage the slavery question indefinitely. People would vote, the majority would rule, and the nation would avoid the crisis of imposing slavery or freedom by federal mandate. He was catastrophically wrong. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed by Congress in May 1854 after brutal debate. President Franklin Pierce, a weak Northern Democrat dominated by Southern advisors, signed it into law on May 30. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Northern newspapers called it a betrayal. The Missouri Compromise had been sacred, a binding contract. Now it was trapped. Abolitionists raged that the slave power had conquered Northern politicians. Even moderate Northerners who'd tolerated slavery in the South were furious at its potential expansion. The Whig Party, already fracturing, collapsed entirely. From its ruins emerged the Republican Party, founded explicitly on opposing slavery's expansion. Its platform was simple: no slavery in the territories, not 1 inch. In the South, the reaction was triumphant. They'd won a political victory. Now they needed to win the actual territory. Because Kansas, the territory directly west of Missouri, became the flashpoint. Geography made it inevitable. Kansas bordered Missouri, a slave state with 90,000 enslaved people. If Kansas became free, it would surround Missouri on 3 sides with free territory, making slavery there untenable. Enslaved people would flee across the border. Missouri's economy would collapse. But if Kansas became a slave state, it would open the entire West to slavery. The balance of power would tip decisively south. The North would be permanently outvoted. Both sides understood Kansas would determine the nation's future. Popular sovereignty sounded neutral, but it guaranteed conflict, because now Kansas wasn't just about Kansas. It was a battlefield where North and South would fight for control of the continent. The weapon would be migration. Whichever side could send more settlers to Kansas would win the vote, and both sides were willing to do anything, including fraud, intimidation, and murder, to win. Douglas watched in growing horror as his compromise ignited the very crisis he'd hoped to avoid. He'd believed Americans were fundamentally pragmatic, that local interests would trump sectional ideology. He'd failed to understand that slavery wasn't a policy disagreement. It was a moral chasm. Northerners increasingly saw it as a sin that must be eradicated. Southerners saw it as the foundation of their civilization, their wealth, their way of life, something worth dying to protect. Kansas would prove both sides meant it. The Kansas-Nebraska Act destroyed the political center. Moderates who'd spent careers crafting compromises were swept aside. The new political language was absolute. Slavery must expand or slavery must die. No middle ground remained. By late 1854, the Migration War had begun. From New England, anti-slavery societies organized emigration companies to send free state settlers to Kansas. From Missouri, pro-slavery organizations recruited Southern settlers and armed them. Kansas had maybe 800 residents when the act passed. By 1855, it would have over 8,000. By 1856, over 20,000. They weren't coming to farm, they were coming to fight. Popular sovereignty had transformed settlement into warfare by other means. Every new arrival was a potential vote, a reinforcement in the struggle for control. And when voting didn't produce the desired result, both sides were prepared to use violence. The first blood would be shed within months. The last wouldn't be spilled until 1865, after 620,000 Americans had died in the Civil War that bleeding Kansas had previewed. Stephen Douglas lived to see his compromise become a catastrophe. He'd meant to build a railroad. Instead, he'd built a road to war. The race to control Kansas began before the Kansas-Nebraska axe ink was dry. Two organized migration campaigns collided in the Kansas territory, each convinced they were fighting for civilization itself. From New England came the New England Emigrant Aid Company, founded in April 1854 by Eli Thayer, a Massachusetts educator and abolitionist. The company's purpose was explicit: flood Kansas with anti-slavery settlers to ensure it became a free state. This was a settlement of political warfare. Thayer raised funds from Northern investors and abolitionists. The company subsidized travel costs for settlers willing to go to Kansas. They organized group departures, safety in numbers. They provided logistical support, guides, supplies, and even pre-selected town sites. By summer 1854, the first company-sponsored settlers were arriving in Kansas. They founded Lawrence in August, naming it after Amos Lawrence, a wealthy Boston merchant who donated heavily to the company. Lawrence was designed as a free state stronghold. The town was carefully planned with wide streets, designated plots for churches and schools, and a strategic position on the Kansas River. It was also heavily armed, because the New England Emigrant Aid Company wasn't just sending farmers, they were sending weapons. Sharps rifles, the most advanced firearms of the era, accurate at 600 yards, were shipped to Kansas in crates marked books or Bibles. The deception fooled no one, and the rifles became known as Beecher's Bibles after Reverend Henry Ward Beecher, who proclaimed that a Sharps rifle was a greater moral argument than the actual Bible in Kansas. Beecher literally held a rifle above his head during a church service, declaring, "There are times when self-defense is a religious duty. If that duty was ever imperative, it is now, and in Kansas." The Free State migration was organized, funded, and ideologically motivated. These weren't desperate people seeking economic opportunity. They were crusaders. From Missouri came a different kind of migration. Missouri in 1854 had 90,000 enslaved people and an economy built on slavery. Kansas's status wasn't abstract politics for Missourians. It was existential. If Kansas became free, Missouri would be surrounded on three sides by free territory. Enslaved people would flee across the border, as they already did into Iowa and Illinois. Slavery in Missouri would become untenable. The state's economy would collapse. Missouri's response was immediate and visceral. Pro-slavery organizations, often called Blue Lodges or social bands, formed across western Missouri. Their purpose, to ensure Kansas became a slave state by any means necessary. Unlike the New England migration, Missouri's wasn't primarily about permanent settlement. It was about control. Thousands of Missourians crossed into Kansas, claimed land, and established pro-slavery settlements. But many were temporary residents, maintaining homes in Missouri while holding Kansas claims solely to vote. They became known as border ruffians, armed Missourians who crossed into Kansas to intimidate free state settlers and dominate elections. Senator David Rice Atchison of Missouri led them, at least spiritually. He'd lost his Senate seat partly due to backlash over Kansas-Nebraska, and he blamed free state abolitionist invaders. He organized armed expeditions into Kansas, declaring, "We will be compelled to shoot, burn and hang, but the thing will soon be over." The border ruffians weren't subtle. They rode in armed groups, flew pro-slavery flags, drank heavily, and threatened violence against damned abolitionists. They established pro-slavery towns like Atchison and Leavenworth, fortified them, and used them as bases for intimidating free state settlements. By late 1854, two distinct populations occupied Kansas: the free state settlers, mostly from New England, Ohio, and other northern states. Educated, organized, ideologically motivated. They established churches, schools, and newspapers. They were armed but preferred legal means, petitioning Congress, organizing politically, voting. The pro-slavery settlers, mostly from Missouri and other border states. Less organized but more willing to use violence. They had a geographic advantage. Missouri was adjacent, allowing constant reinforcement. They controlled territorial government positions through federal appointments by the pro-Southern President Pierce. The demographics favored free state settlers. By early 1855, Kansas probably had 6,000, 8,000 residents, and roughly 60–70% were anti-slavery. But demographics didn't guarantee victory, because popular sovereignty required voting, and voting could be manipulated. The first test came in November 1854, electing a territorial delegate to Congress. The Free State candidate was ex-Congressman Andrew Reeder, appointed territorial governor by President Pierce, but sympathetic to free state settlers. The pro-slavery candidate was J.W. Whitfield. On Election Day, approximately 1,500 Missourians crossed the border illegally to vote for Whitfield. They overwhelmed the legal Kansas electorate. Whitfield won. Free staters protested the fraud, but Governor Reeder certified the result. He had no choice. He'd seen the armed Missourians and knew challenging them meant violence. The message was clear. Elections in Kansas would be won not by who lived there, but by who could bring the most voters, legal or otherwise. Both sides prepared for the next election, the territorial legislature in March 1855. That election would determine who controlled Kansas's laws. Free state settlers organized registration drives, ensuring their supporters were documented. They also armed themselves. Every free state settlement had a militia. Every church had a rifle cache. Pro-slavery forces in Missouri prepared differently. They organized a massive, coordinated invasion for Election Day. Thousands of Missourians would cross the border simultaneously, vote, and return home before anyone could stop them. The stage was set for Kansas's first fraudulent election and the violence that would follow. The Migration War had transformed Kansas into a proxy battlefield. Northern and Southern settlers weren't building a territory. They were positioning armies. Every town founded, every farm claimed, every rifle shipped. All were moves in a chess game where the stakes were national power, and both sides were willing to cheat, intimidate, and kill to win. March 30, 1855. Election Day in the Kansas Territory. The stakes: a territorial legislature that would write Kansas's laws and determine its future as free or slave. What happened that day was the most blatantly fraudulent election in American history to that point, and it pushed Kansas past the point of peaceful resolution. The eligible voters, approximately 2,900 registered Kansas residents, the votes cast over 6,300. The difference? Roughly 5,000 Missourians who crossed the border illegally voted and returned home. This wasn't a few irregularities. This was organized, massive, undeniable fraud. The invasion was coordinated. Pro-slavery leaders in Missouri, including Senator Atchison, organized what they called emigration parties. Thousands of men gathered at border towns like Westport, Independence, and Weston. They were armed with revolvers, Bowie knives, and rifles. They traveled in large groups for intimidation effect. Many were drunk. They made no secret of their purpose: to vote pro-slavery by any means necessary. Contemporary accounts describe the scene. At one polling place in Lawrence, 1034 votes were cast. Only 369 were legal residents. The rest were Missourians who arrived in wagons, voted, and left. At another polling location, election judges who questioned illegal voters were threatened with hanging. They certified the fraudulent votes rather than risk death. Armed Missourians surrounded polling places, creating what we'd now call voter intimidation. Free state settlers who tried to vote were threatened, sometimes physically prevented from approaching ballot boxes. Some free state voters were told they'd be shot if they attempted to cast ballots. Others were simply pushed aside by mobs of border ruffians. The ballot boxes themselves were compromised. In several locations, Missourians served as election judges, directly controlling the count. In others, pro-slavery voters openly voted multiple times while judges looked away. One witness, a free state settler named William Hutchinson, testified later. "I saw wagon loads of men arriving from Missouri, armed with revolvers, Bowie knives, and clubs. They announced they'd come to vote and kill every damned abolitionist if necessary." The judges were terrified and accepted every ballot. Governor Andrew Reeder, though initially sympathetic to the South, was appalled. He investigated the fraud personally, visiting polling places and interviewing witnesses. His findings were damning: massive, coordinated, undeniable fraud. He threw out results from several districts and ordered new elections. The pro-slavery legislature, once seated, simply refused to recognize his authority. They declared themselves the legitimate government and invalidated Reeder's special elections. Then they went further. They passed laws making it illegal to question slavery in Kansas. The Kansas Code, enacted in the summer of 1855, included advocating against slavery, punishable by 2 years hard labor circulating anti-slavery literature, punishable by 5 years hard labor helping enslaved people escape, punishable by death questioning the legitimacy of the territorial legislature, punishable by imprisonment. These weren't laws designed to govern. They were weapons designed to crush opposition. Free state settlers faced a catastrophic dilemma. The legal territorial government was fraudulently elected and passed laws that criminalized their beliefs. They could submit to accept pro-slavery rule despite being the majority, or resist. They chose resistance. In September 1855, free state leaders called a convention in Big Springs, Kansas. They repudiated the fraudulent legislature entirely, declaring it had no legitimacy. In October, they held their own constitutional convention in Topeka. They drafted a free state constitution prohibiting slavery and elected their own shadow government with Charles Robinson as governor. Kansas now had two governments: the official territorial legislature in Lecompton, pro-slavery, elected through fraud, recognized by President Pierce, and the federal government, the free state government in Topeka, anti-slavery, elected by actual Kansas residents, unrecognized federally but claiming moral legitimacy. This was more than political disagreement. It was dual sovereignty, the condition that precedes civil war. The federal government, under President Pierce, faced a choice: recognize the fraud and back the pro-slavery legislature, or acknowledge the free state majority and risk Southern backlash. Pierce chose the South. He declared the Topeka government illegal and treasonous. He authorized federal troops to support the Lecompton legislature. This radicalized free state settlers. The federal government, their government, was actively supporting the theft of their rights. Northern newspapers exploded with outrage. The New York Tribune called it the rape of Kansas. Horace Greeley wrote, "Kansas has been stolen by armed invasion and federal complicity. If elections can be stolen with impunity, the republic is dead." Immigrant aid societies redoubled their efforts. More settlers, more rifles, more money. Kansas became the abolitionist cause célèbre. In the South, newspapers celebrated. The Charleston Mercury wrote, "The abolitionists sought to steal Kansas through northern immigration. Missouri defended its rights and interests. This is proper and just." Both sides were now convinced. The other side had abandoned democracy. Elections were meaningless. Law was a weapon. Only force remained. The fraudulent election of March 1855 destroyed any possibility of a peaceful resolution. It proved that popular sovereignty was a sham. Whoever could mobilize the most armed men would win, regardless of who actually lived in Kansas. And it taught both sides a lesson they'd apply with increasing violence. Democracy only works if both sides accept the results. When one side cheats, the other has no reason to accept the outcome. By winter 1855-56, Kansas was 2 armed camps preparing for war. Free state militias drilled in Lawrence, Topeka, and other settlements. Pro-slavery forces fortified Lecompton, Atchison, and Leavenworth. The territorial legislature in Lecompton issued arrest warrants for free state leaders, charging them with treason. The free state government in Topeka issued its own laws and warrants. Federal troops didn't know who to obey. Kansas had become ungovernable. The question was no longer if violence would erupt, but when. The answer came in May 1856, when pro-slavery forces decided to destroy Lawrence, the symbol of free state resistance. The sack of Lawrence would finally ignite the war both sides had been preparing for since the fraudulent election. Lawrence, Kansas, May 21, 1856. The Free State capital was about to be destroyed. Lawrence had become the symbol of Northern resistance, a planned abolitionist town, home to the Free State government defended by armed settlers with Sharps rifles. Its newspapers, the Kansas Free State and Herald of Freedom, published anti-slavery editorials that enraged pro-slavery forces. The territorial legislature in Lecompton wanted Lawrence destroyed, not just defeated, erased. The pretext was in April, a pro-slavery grand jury in Lecompton had indicted Free State leaders for treason and declared Lawrence's newspapers and the Free State Hotel headquarters of the Emigrant Aid Company to be nuisances that should be abated, legal language for destroyed. On May 21, approximately 800 armed men marched on Lawrence. They came under multiple authorities: U.S. Marshal Israel Donaldson with a federal posse to arrest the traitors, Sheriff Samuel Jones with a territorial posse to abate the nuisance, Senator David Atchison leading Missouri militia volunteers. They brought 5 cannons for a town of 1,500 people with no army. The Free State leadership faced an impossible choice: fight or surrender. Lawrence had hundreds of armed men. They had Sharps rifles, defensive positions, and determination. They could have turned the town into a slaughterhouse. But Free State leaders, especially Charles Robinson and James Lane, understood the larger game. If they fired first, it would justify federal intervention on the pro-slavery side. The North would see them as rebels, not victims. They chose martyrdom over battle. Robinson issued orders: do not resist, let them come. The North needs to see pro-slavery aggression for what it is. When the pro-slavery force arrived, Lawrence's defenders stood aside. They watched unarmed as 800 armed men marched into their town. Marshal Donaldson made a show of arresting the traitors, except most Free State leaders had already fled. He arrested a handful of men, then declared his mission accomplished. He left. His duty was done. What came next wasn't law enforcement. It was terrorism. Sheriff Jones, whose authority was questionable at best, took command. He announced that the nuisances would now be abated. The mob descended on the Herald of Freedom newspaper office. They smashed the printing press, threw the type into the Kansas River, and burned the building. Then the Kansas Free State office. Same treatment. Press destroyed, building burned. Then the Free State Hotel, a 3-story stone building, the finest structure in Kansas. Jones had his men plant kegs of gunpowder in the basement and fire cannon at the walls. The explosions damaged but didn't destroy the building, so they set it on fire. While it burned, the mob looted Lawrence. They ransacked homes, stealing valuables, destroying furniture, and terrorizing residents. Robinson's house was particularly targeted: furniture smashed, belongings stolen, walls defaced. The only confirmed death was accidental. A pro-slavery man was killed when a wall collapsed on him. but the destruction was systematic and deliberate. The message was clear: oppose slavery, and this is what happens to you. By evening, the mob dispersed. They destroyed 2 newspapers, burned the Free State Hotel, looted dozens of homes, and terrorized the entire town. They rode back to Missoula, and I was celebrating. They'd struck a blow against abolitionist aggression. They'd shown that Free State Kansas could be destroyed with impunity. They were catastrophically wrong about the consequences. News of the sack of Lawrence spread instantly. Free State settlers sent reports to northern newspapers describing the attack as an atrocity. Armed invasion, destruction of the free press, terrorism against civilians. Northern newspapers exploded with outrage. The New York Tribune's headline: "Kansas invaded Lawrence in ruins, war begun." Horace Greeley wrote, "The barbarism of slavery reveals itself. They cannot tolerate free speech, free press, or free men. They rule through violence because reason has abandoned them." Abolitionist meetings across the North raised funds for Kansas relief. Immigrant aid societies doubled their efforts. Sharp's rifles shipped by the hundreds. But in the South, the reaction was jubilant. The Charleston Mercury celebrated. "Lawrence, that den of abolition fanatics, has been justly chastised. Let this be a lesson to all who would interfere with Southern rights." Southern newspapers framed it as law enforcement, a marshal executing warrants, a sheriff abating nuisances. If Lawrence resisted, they should have been destroyed entirely. The 2 regions inhabited completely different realities. Northerners saw unprovoked terrorism. Southerners saw justified law enforcement. There was no shared truth anymore, just competing narratives that made compromise impossible. In Washington, the violence spread from Kansas to the Capitol itself. On May 1920, Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts delivered a speech called "The Crime Against Kansas," savaging pro-slavery forces, and personally insulting Senator Andrew Butler of South Carolina. On May 22, the day after Lawrence's destruction, Congressman Preston Brooks, Butler's cousin, entered the Senate chamber and beat Sumner nearly to death with a cane. Sumner collapsed, blood pouring from head wounds. He suffered brain damage and couldn't return to the Senate for 3 years. Brooks became a Southern hero. Supporters sent him replacement canes. One was inscribed, "Hit him again." Northerners were horrified. A senator beaten unconscious in the Capitol for giving a speech. Southern barbarism had invaded the heart of government. The sack of Lawrence and the caning of Sumner happened within 24 hours. Together, they demonstrated that violence was now the political language of North and South. In Kansas, Free State settlers drew the obvious conclusion: peaceful resistance had failed. Lawrence had surrendered peacefully and been destroyed anyway. If they wanted to survive, they'd have to fight. One man had already reached that conclusion. His name was John Brown, and he'd been planning revenge since news of Lawrence reached him. 3 days after the sack of Lawrence, Brown would launch the most brutal act of terrorism in Kansas's bloody history and prove that Free State settlers could be just as savage as the border ruffians. John Brown was 56 years old in 1856, and he'd failed at everything except hatred. Failed farmer, failed businessman, failed shepherd. He'd declared bankruptcy multiple times, lost children to disease, and wandered through life certain that God had chosen him for some special purpose. In Kansas, he founded Holy War Against Slavery. Brown had arrived in Kansas in 1855 with 5 of his sons, ostensibly to settle and farm. But farming was never his purpose. He'd come to fight. Brown was a radical abolitionist who believed slavery was not just wrong but a sin against God that required violent purging. He carried a Bible and believed himself an instrument of divine wrath. His sons described him as terrifying when his Kansas mood came upon him, eyes blazing, quoting Old Testament vengeance, convinced that God spoke directly to him. By May 1856, Brown was living near Pottawatomie in southeastern Kansas, a Free State settlement surrounded by pro-slavery neighbors. When news of the sack of Lawrence reached him on May 22, Brown's response was immediate and chilling. He told his sons and followers, "Something must be done to show these barbarians that we too have rights." His plan wasn't a defense, it was terrorism. The target, pro-slavery settlers along Pottawatomie Creek, about 20 miles from Brown's camp. These weren't border ruffians or militia. They were settlers. Southern sympathizing families who'd moved to Kansas claimed land and supported the pro-slavery legislature. They hadn't participated in the Lawrence attack. They weren't military targets, but to Brown they represented the enemy, and God, he believed, demanded their deaths. On the night of May 24-25, 1856, Brown led 7 men, including 4 of his sons, on what he called a retaliatory strike. They were armed with broadswords, short sabers. Brown had specifically chosen blades instead of guns. He wanted this to be personal, visceral, terrifying. The first target, James Doyle's cabin. Brown's party arrived after midnight, pounding on the door. When Doyle answered, they forced their way in at gunpoint. Brown asked if Doyle supported the pro-slavery legislature. Doyle admitted he did. Brown ordered him and his 2 adult sons outside. Doyle's wife begged for mercy. Brown ignored her, though he spared the youngest son, 14-year-old John, telling Mrs. Doyle, "I will not harm the boy." The 3 Doyle men were marched 100 yards from the cabin. Then Brown's men fell upon them with broadswords. James Doyle was stabbed in the chest and head. His son William's head was nearly severed. His son Drury was hacked to pieces, fingers cut off as he tried to defend himself. All 3 bled to death in the darkness while Mrs. Doyle and her youngest son listened to the screams. The second target, Allen Wilkinson, a pro-slavery legislator. Brown's party dragged Wilkinson from his bed away from his sick wife. They took him to the edge of Pottawatomie Creek and killed him with sword blows to the head and body. The third target, James Harris's cabin. Harris wasn't home, but his house guest, William Sherman, no relation to the Civil War general, was there. Brown's men took Sherman outside and killed him. Sword wounds to the chest, arms and skull. By dawn, 5 men were dead, all killed brutally, intimately with blades. Their bodies were discovered throughout the day by horrified neighbors. The massacre shocked even Free State settlers. This wasn't warfare, this wasn't self-defense, this was murder. Calculated, personal, and terroristic. Brown's own son, Jason Brown, who hadn't participated, later wrote, "Father went crazy. The Kansas violence had unhinged his mind. He believed he was God's instrument, chosen to kill in the Lord's name." But John Brown showed no remorse. When questioned by Free State leaders, he justified the killings. It was necessary to strike terror into the hearts of pro-slavery settlers. They must know that we will fight, that we will kill, that we are not afraid. He also framed it as biblical justice. He quoted Hebrews, "Without the shedding of blood, there is no remission of sin." Kansas's sin was tolerating slavery. Blood was the remedy. The Pottawatomie massacre achieved Brown's goal, terror. Pro-slavery settlers were horrified and enraged. Free State settlers were divided. Some praised Brown's courage, others condemned his brutality. But everyone understood the rules had changed. Civilians were now targets. Murder was now justified as political action. Pro-slavery forces demanded revenge. Missouri militia organized reprisal raids. Within weeks, Kansas erupted into full guerrilla warfare. Brown became a terrorist and a folk hero simultaneously. Free State settlers who publicly condemned the massacre privately admired his willingness to fight. Songs were written celebrating Old Brown of Pottawatomie. Money flowed to him from Northern abolitionists, including prominent Boston intellectuals who knew exactly what he'd done and funded him anyway. The psychological impact was profound. Before Pottawatomie, violence in Kansas had been mostly about intimidation, threats, property destruction, occasional deaths in skirmishes. After Pottawatomie, it was about killing. Deliberate, targeted, personal murder. Both sides escalated. Both sides, as pro-slavery forces no longer just threatened Free State settlers, they killed them. Free State forces responded in kind. The summer of 1856 would see Kansas descend into chaos. Raids, ambushes, massacres, and guerrilla warfare that killed hundreds and destroyed entire communities. John Brown's role in bleeding Kansas didn't end with Pottawatomie. He'd fight several more engagements, most famously the Battle of Pottawatomie in August, where his son Frederick was killed. But Pottawatomie was his signature act. Calculated terrorism justified as a divine mission. It also established Brown's method and philosophy: violence in God's name. So, killing isn't an unfortunate necessity but a righteous duty. The belief that evil, slavery, could only be purged through blood. These beliefs would drive Brown to his final act, The 1859 raid on Harper's Ferry, an attempt to spark a slave uprising that would drench the South in violence. Pottawatomie was the blueprint. Harper's Ferry was the sequel, and both proved that the middle ground in America had vanished. Compromise was dead. Only violence remained. Kansas was no longer bleeding, it was hemorrhaging. Summer 1856. Kansas became a war zone. After Pottawatomie and Lawrence, all restraint vanished. Both sides organized armed bands that raided enemy settlements, burned homes, murdered civilians, and spread terror across the territory. This wasn't conventional warfare with armies, uniforms, and battles. This was guerrilla warfare, small groups attacking soft targets, then disappearing before an organized response was possible. The tactics were borrowed from frontier Indian fighting and would later be perfected in the Civil War. But in 1856, Kansas was being field-tested on American civilians by other Americans. The pro-slavery forces organized around several leaders. David Atchison, the former senator, led the Missouri militia into Kansas on punitive expeditions. His goal: destroy free state settlements and drive abolitionists out of Kansas entirely. Henry Clay Pattay, a Virginia newspaperman turned militia leader, commanded a company that hunted John Brown and raided free state homesteads. Charles Hamilton, a Georgian, led the most brutal pro-slavery raids, including the Marais des Cygnes massacre. These weren't official military forces, they were vigilantes, though territorial authorities and Missouri politicians often supported them tacitly. Free state forces organized similarly. James Lane, the most effective free state military leader, commanded the Army of the North. Several hundred armed settlers who defended free state towns and launched retaliatory communities became fortified camps. Free state towns built earthwork defenses and stationed sentries. Lawrence eventually had 4 forts, a defensive perimeter, and 500 men under arms constantly. Pro-slavery towns did the same. Lecompton was fortified. Atchison had defensive positions. Leavenworth maintained armed patrols. The U.S. Army presence was inadequate and confused. Federal troops numbered only a few hundred across the entire territory. Commanders received contradictory orders: maintain order but don't interfere with popular sovereignty. Support the territorial government, but don't favor one side. Colonel Edwin Sumner commanded federal forces and tried desperately to prevent massacres. He dispersed armed gatherings, positioned troops between hostile forces, and negotiated truces. But he couldn't be everywhere. And both sides were skilled at avoiding federal troops while attacking undefended targets. The death toll climbed. Exact numbers are impossible. Many deaths went unrecorded, bodies were hidden, and both sides minimized their losses while exaggerating the enemies. Conservative estimates: 200 killed in Kansas violence, 1854-1859. Most died in 1856. But numbers don't capture the terror. Kansas had become a place where political affiliation could get you killed. Your home could be burned because of how you voted. Where guerrilla bands roamed the countryside hunting enemies. The psychological damage was profound. Settlers who'd come seeking farmland found themselves sleeping with rifles, teaching children to shoot, and abandoning homes when raiders approached. Some gave up and left. Emigration out of Kansas spiked in late 1856. Free state and pro-slavery settlers alike concluded the territory was too dangerous. Others hardened. The violence radicalized both sides. Moderates were pushed out or silenced. The men who remained were those willing to kill and die for their cause. By autumn 1856, new territorial Governor Geary managed to impose fragile order through aggressive federal intervention. He arrested leaders on both sides, dispersed armed bands, and threatened to call in the U.S. Army in force. The large-scale violence subsided, but the hatred didn't. Kansas had become a training ground. The guerrilla fighters, men like James Lane, Doc Jennison, William Quantrill, who'd later lead pro-Confederate raiders during the Civil War, and the James brothers who started as Kansas guerrillas, learned their craft in Bleeding Kansas. The tactics they developed: night raids, ambushes, terrorism of civilians, total war against enemy communities, would be used with devastating effect in the Civil War. Kansas was bleeding, but soon the entire nation would hemorrhage. The violence in Kansas spread to the U.S. Capitol like an infection. May 1920, 1856, 2 days before the sack of Lawrence, Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts rose in the Senate chamber to deliver what he believed would be the definitive speech on Kansas. Sumner was a leading abolitionist, a founder of the Republican Party, and a man whose self-righteousness was matched only by his verbal cruelty. At 6'4", physically imposing, he was known for speeches that combined classical erudition with savage personal attacks. His speech was titled, "The Crime Against Kansas." It lasted 5 hours over 2 days. Sumner described the pro-slavery campaign in Kansas as a crime against democracy, against civilization, against God. He detailed the fraudulent elections, the violence, and the destruction of Lawrence. But he went further, into personal insult. He targeted Senator Andrew Butler of South Carolina, an elderly pro-slavery Democrat who wasn't present. Sumner mocked Butler's speech impediment caused by a stroke, implied he was senile, and used sexual metaphors suggesting Butler had taken slavery as a mistress. The senator from South Carolina has chosen a mistress, the harlot slavery. For her, his tongue is always profuse in words. She has been made his daily companionship. This wasn't a policy debate. This was character assassination designed to humiliate. Sumner also attacked Stephen Douglas, calling him a noisome squat and nameless animal, not a proper model of an American senator. Douglas, who was short, was furious. He reportedly muttered, "That damned fool will get himself killed by some other damned fool." The prophecy was accurate. Among those who read Sumner's speech was Congressman Preston Brooks of South Carolina, a cousin of Andrew Butler. Brooks was 37, a Mexican War veteran, a defender of slavery and Southern honor. He was also a believer in the code duello, the honor culture that demanded a violent response to an insult. In that culture, Sumner's speech was unforgivable. He'd insulted Butler publicly, questioned his manhood, and mocked his physical infirmity. Honor demanded a response, but there was a problem. Sumner was a senator, technically a social equal. The code duello required challenging him to a duel. Brooks considered this, but he concluded that Sumner, as an abolitionist, had no honor and therefore didn't deserve a duel. He deserved what one did to social inferiors: physical beating. May 22, 1856, 2 days after Sumner's speech, the same day as the sack of Lawrence. The Senate had adjourned for the day. Sumner remained at his desk, writing letters. Brooks entered the Senate chamber accompanied by Congressman Lawrence Cate, a fellow South Carolinian who was there to prevent anyone from interfering. Brooks approached Sumner's desk. He said, "Mr. Sumner, I have read your speech twice over carefully. It is a libel on South Carolina and Mr. Butler, who is a relative of mine." Before Sumner could respond, Brooks began beating him with a gutta-percha cane, a walking stick made of hardened rubber, heavy and flexible. The first blow struck Sumner's head. He tried to stand but was trapped. The desk was bolted to the floor and his legs were beneath it. Brooks rained blows on Sumner's head and shoulders. Sumner, desperate, wrenched the desk from the floor and staggered into the aisle, blood pouring from his scalp. Brooks continued beating him. The cane shattered from the force of the blows. Brooks grabbed the pieces and kept hitting. Sumner collapsed, unconscious, blood pooling on the Senate floor. Other senators tried to intervene, but Cate drew a pistol and threatened anyone who approached. "Let them be." Finally, Brooks stopped. Sumner lay motionless, covered in blood. Brooks calmly walked out of the chamber. Sumner suffered severe head trauma, brain damage, and psychological trauma. He couldn't return to the Senate for 3 years. Massachusetts left its seat empty as a symbol of Southern violence. The Northern reaction was explosive horror. Newspapers called it barbarism. The New York Tribune, "The spirit of slavery reveals itself, brutal, violent, contemptuous of law and civilization." Abolitionists held mass meetings. The attack became proof that Southerners were savages who couldn't be reasoned with, only fought. Republican politicians used the caning as campaign material. Bleeding Sumner joined Bleeding Kansas as symbols of Southern aggression. Artists created images of the attack that circulated widely. Brooks portrayed as a monster, Sumner as a martyr. The caning radicalized Northern opinion more effectively than any abolitionist speech. This wasn't distant violence in Kansas territory. This was violence in the Capitol against a senator during peacetime. The Southern reaction was a jubilant celebration. Brooks became a hero. He was censured by the House but not expelled. Southern congressmen blocked expulsion. Brooks resigned in protest, returned to South Carolina, and was immediately re-elected unanimously. Southern supporters sent him replacement cane. One was inscribed, "Hit him again." Another, "Use knockdown arguments." The Richmond Whig wrote, "We consider the act good in conception, better in execution, and best of all in consequences. The vulgar abolitionists in the Senate must be lashed into submission." Southern newspapers framed it as justified. Sumner had insulted a Southern gentleman and received appropriate correction. The caning revealed that North and South no longer shared basic assumptions about appropriate behavior, law, or civilization. Northerners saw unprovoked violence against free speech. Southerners saw a justified defense of honor. There was no common ground. The caning also demonstrated that violence was now the primary political language. Words had failed. Compromise had failed. Now there were fists, canes, and guns. Senator William Seward, a Republican, began carrying a pistol in the Senate. Others followed. The U.S. Congress was becoming an armed camp, just like Kansas. Bleeding Kansas and Bleeding Sumner, two events within 24 hours, proved the Republic was breaking apart, and neither side was willing to stop. By 1857, the violence in Kansas had subsided to sporadic raids, but the political war intensified. The question remained, would Kansas enter the Union as free or slave? Pro-slavery forces, despite being a minority among actual Kansas residents, controlled the territorial government. They decided to force the issue by writing a state constitution and applying for admission. The Lecompton Constitutional Convention assembled in autumn 1857. It was dominated by pro-slavery delegates elected in yet another fraudulent election that free staters had boycotted. The constitution they drafted was designed to ensure slavery's survival regardless of popular will. The key provision: slavery was explicitly legalized and protected. But here was the trick. The Constitution couldn't be amended to prohibit slavery for 7 years. And the enslaved people already in Kansas, there were maybe 200, would remain enslaved forever, even if the Constitution was later amended. It was a trap. Even if free staters won future elections and voted to prohibit slavery, the existing enslaved population would remain. And 7 years was plenty of time to import more enslaved people, creating a permanent pro-slavery constituency. The referendum was equally fraudulent. Voters were given two choices: Constitution with slavery, Constitution without slavery. There was no option to reject the Constitution entirely, and the without slavery option still protected existing enslaved people. It just prevented importing more. Free state settlers recognized the fraud immediately. Both options led to slavery in Kansas. The vote was rigged. Free state leaders called for a boycott. Don't vote. Don't legitimize this fraud. The boycott worked, mostly. In December 1857, the referendum passed with 6,226 votes for with slavery and 569 for without slavery. But only about 2,000 of those votes were legitimate. The rest were fraudulent, Missourians voting illegally, names copied from censuses, votes invented, and 90% of Kansas's actual residents hadn't voted at all. The pro-slavery legislature certified the results and sent the Lecompton Constitution to Congress, demanding that Kansas be admitted as a slave state. President James Buchanan, a Pennsylvania Democrat dominated by Southern advisors, supported Lecompton. He saw it as legitimate and pressured Congress to admit Kansas. But Buchanan faced unexpected opposition from his own party. Stephen Douglas, author of the Kansas-Nebraska Act and champion of popular sovereignty, was furious. Lecompton was a mockery of everything he'd promised. Popular sovereignty meant letting actual residents decide. Lecompton was decided by fraud and boycott. Fewer than 1/3 of Kansas residents had voted, and half of those votes were illegal. Douglas broke with Buchanan, a catastrophic split in the Democratic Party. He announced he'd oppose Lecompton in the Senate. His motives were mixed. Partly principle. He genuinely believed in popular sovereignty and saw Lecompton as a betrayal. Partly politics. He had presidential ambitions and needed Northern support. If he backed Lecompton, Northern Democrats would abandon him. The debate over Lecompton consumed Congress through the winter of 1857-58. Southern senators demanded admission. Kansas had followed proper procedures. They had a constitution. The vote was certified. Congress should admit them. Northern Republicans opposed Lecompton as fraudulent. Senator William Seward called it the grossest violation of popular sovereignty yet attempted. And Douglas, breaking with his party, sided with Republicans. He gave a powerful speech detailing Lecompton's fraud and demanding honest elections. The alliance between Douglas and the Republicans was temporary and strategic. They still disagreed about slavery fundamentally, but they agreed Lecompton was a travesty. In the House, Lecompton faced even stronger opposition. Northern Democrats joined Republicans to form a majority against it. After months of deadlock, a compromise emerged. The English Bill. Kansas would hold another referendum. If they approved Lecompton, they'd be admitted immediately. If they rejected it, statehood would be delayed until Kansas's population reached 93,420, the minimum for a congressional seat. This was designed as bribery. Accept slavery and get statehood now, reject it and wait years. Free staters, though angry at the manipulation, accepted the referendum because this time they'd vote. In August 1858, Kansas held the fairest election in its history. Federal troops ensured no Missouri invasion. Polling places were monitored. Votes were counted honestly. The result, 11,300 to 1788 against Lecompton. Kansas had rejected slavery overwhelmingly. The Free State victory was decisive and undeniable. Even President Buchanan couldn't dispute it. But statehood was delayed. Under the English Bill, Kansas needed to wait until its population grew. That delay would last until January 29, 1861. By which point 7 southern states had seceded. And admitting Kansas as a free state was no longer controversial, because the South was no longer in the Union. The Lecompton crisis had major consequences. It destroyed the Democratic Party's unity. Douglas and Buchanan never reconciled. Southern Democrats viewed Douglas as a traitor. Northern Democrats were split between Douglas supporters and Buchanan loyalists. This split would fracture the party in the 1860 election, allowing Abraham Lincoln to win with only 40% of the popular vote. It empowered Republicans. Their opposition to Lecompton won them credibility with moderate Northerners who weren't abolitionists but opposed obvious fraud. It proved that popular sovereignty couldn't work. Douglas's grand idea, let settlers decide, had produced 5 years of fraud, violence, and chaos. The concept was discredited. It radicalized both sections. Northerners saw Lecompton as proof of a slave power conspiracy to force slavery everywhere, even against the majority's will. Southerners saw its defeat as Northern aggression, a refusal to accept Southern rights even when Southerners followed proper procedures. The middle ground continued shrinking. Kansas had finally settled the slavery question through fair elections. But the nation couldn't accept the result. The South wouldn't accept a free Kansas because it threatened their political power. The North wouldn't forgive the years of fraud and violence it took to reach a fair vote. And the man who'd caused it all, Stephen Douglas, watched his presidential ambitions die in the wreckage of his Kansas policy. But one Kansas veteran saw opportunity in the polarization, John Brown. He'd left Kansas in 1858, but he was planning his masterpiece, an act of violence so extreme it would push the nation past the breaking point. Harper's Ferry was coming, and Kansas had taught Brown exactly how to do it. John Brown left Kansas in 1858, but Kansas never left him. He'd spent 3 years in the territory, fighting, killing, watching his son murdered, living in caves and fortified cabins, hunted by federal authorities and pro-slavery militias. He emerged from Kansas transformed, not just radicalized. He'd been radical before, but convinced that God had given him a mission that required violence on a scale Kansas hadn't seen. Slavery wouldn't end through politics or voting. It would end through blood and fire. Brown spent 1858 and early 1859 traveling through the North, raising money from wealthy abolitionists. He called them the Secret Six. 6 prominent men who knew what Brown was planning and funded it anyway. Thomas Wentworth Higginson, a Unitarian minister. Theodore Parker, another minister and intellectual. Samuel Gridley Howe, physician and educator. Franklin Sanborn, teacher and writer. Gerrit Smith, a wealthy landowner. George Luther Stearns, industrialist. Brown told them his plan: raid a federal arsenal, seize weapons, arm enslaved people in Virginia, and trigger a massive slave uprising across the South. It was insane, tactically impossible, morally questionable even to abolitionists who'd supported Kansas violence. But Brown's certainty was absolute. He'd seen God's will in Kansas. Every pro-slavery man he'd killed at Pottawatomie Creek had been divinely ordained. Now God wanted him to strike at slavery's heart. The Secret Six gave him money. Not all of them believed the plan would work, but they believed in John Brown's willingness to die for the cause. And they believed the South needed to be terrified. Brown recruited followers, 21 men total, including 3 of his sons, 5 black men, including Dangerfield Newby, a freedman trying to buy his enslaved wife's freedom, and 13 white abolitionists. They gathered at a rented farmhouse in Maryland, across the Potomac River from Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Harper's Ferry was a small town at the confluence of the Potomac and Shenandoah rivers. It housed a federal armory and arsenal, thousands of rifles, muskets, and ammunition. Brown planned to seize the arsenal on a Sunday night when it was lightly guarded, take hostages, send armed parties into the countryside to spread word of the uprising, and arm enslaved people who would flock to join the rebellion. Then they'd retreat to the Appalachian Mountains and wage guerrilla warfare. Exactly what Brown had learned in Kansas. On the night of October 16, 1859, Brown and his men walked across the bridge into Harper's Ferry. They easily captured the armory and arsenal, cutting telegraph wires and taking hostages, including Lewis Washington, a great-grandnephew of George Washington. Then they waited for enslaved people to arrive and join the uprising. No one came. The enslaved population in the Harper's Ferry area had no idea what was happening. Brown had sent no advance word. The few black people who learned of the raid were terrified, not inspired. This wasn't liberation, it was a suicide mission. By Monday morning, October 17th, local militia surrounded the armory. Brown and his men were trapped. President James Buchanan ordered federal troops to retake the arsenal. Command was given to Colonel Robert E. Lee, with Lieutenant J.B. Stewart as his aide. Both men would, within 2 years, become Confederate generals. On the morning of October 18th, Marines stormed the engine house, where Brown and his surviving men had barricaded themselves. The assault took 3 minutes. 10 of Brown's men were killed, including 2 of his sons. 7 escaped. Brown and 4 others were captured, wounded. Brown had been shot, bayoneted, and beaten, but he was conscious, and when interrogated, he showed no regret. "I think, my friend, you are guilty of a great wrong against God and humanity," he told his captors. Virginia Governor Henry Wise questioned Brown personally. He expected a madman. Instead, he found a lucid, articulate zealot who calmly explained that slavery was a sin against God and violent resistance was righteous. Wise was shaken. This wasn't a lunatic. This was something more dangerous, a true believer. Brown was tried for treason against Virginia murder and conspiring with slaves to rebel. The trial lasted 1 week. The verdict was never in doubt. Guilty. Sentenced to hang on December 2, 1859. Brown's execution became a national theater. Southern states mobilized militia, terrified of rescue attempts or coordinated slave uprisings. Northern abolitionists mourned. Some planned, but never executed rescue operations. Brown spent his final weeks writing letters that Northern newspapers published. He was eloquent, defiant, and unrepentant. "I am worth inconceivably more to hang than for any other purpose." He was right. On December 2, 1859, John Brown was led to the gallows in Charlestown, Virginia. He'd written a final prophecy that morning. "I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood." The rope went around his neck, the trap dropped. He died instantly. Among the witnesses, John Wilkes Booth, the actor who would assassinate Abraham Lincoln 6 years later, and Thomas Stonewall Jackson, commanding a Virginia militia unit. In the North, church bells tolled. Thoreau, Emerson, and other intellectuals praised Brown as a martyr. Songs were written. John Brown's body became an anthem. In the South, Brown confirmed every fear. The North was sending armed fanatics to murder Southerners and incite slave rebellions. Compromise was impossible. The enemy wanted blood. Harper's Ferry was a tactical failure. Brown's plan was nonsense. The slave uprising never materialized, but strategically it was devastatingly successful. Brown had wanted to prove that the peaceful resolution of slavery was impossible, that violence was inevitable. Both sides should prepare for war. He succeeded completely. The line from Pottawatomie Creek to Harper's Ferry was direct. Brown had learned in Kansas that terrorism worked. It radicalized both sides, made compromise impossible, and normalized violence as political language. Now he taught that lesson to the entire nation. 16 months after Brown's hanging, the Civil War began, and Union soldiers marched into battle singing about the madman from Kansas who'd started it all. John Brown's body was barely cold before the South started preparing for war. In the weeks after Harper's Ferry, Virginia Governor Henry Wise received reports, most false, of similar plots across the South. Abolitionists supposedly stockpiled weapons in Kentucky. Slave uprisings planned in Tennessee. Northern agents are infiltrating plantations. Paranoia became policy. Southern states expanded militia forces. Vigilance committees investigated suspected abolitionists. Strangers were questioned, sometimes hanged. The mail was monitored for incendiary abolitionist literature. The South was terrified, and terror makes compromise impossible. Northern reaction was equally extreme. In the opposite direction, moderate Northerners who'd opposed abolitionist violence now reconsidered. If the South had hanged a man for trying to free slaves, maybe the abolitionists were right about Southern brutality. Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote that Brown's execution made the gallows glorious like the cross. Henry David Thoreau declared Brown an angel of light. These weren't radical. These were mainstream Northern intellectuals now openly celebrating a man who'd hacked 5 people to death in Kansas and tried to trigger a race war in Virginia. The center was collapsing. Bleeding Kansas had taught both sides that violence worked. Harper's Ferry proved that violence was now the only language left. Into this powder keg walked the 1860 presidential election. 4 candidates, Abraham Lincoln, Republican, opposed slavery expansion, supported keeping it out of territories, moderate by Republican standards, but considered radical by the South. Stephen Douglas, Northern Democrat, popular sovereignty advocate whose Kansas-Nebraska Act started the whole catastrophe, split from Southern Democrats over the Lecompton Constitution. John C. Breckinridge, Southern Democrat, pro-slavery, demanded federal protection of slavery in all territories. John Bell, Constitutional Union, desperately trying to avoid discussing slavery at all, just preserve the Union. The Democratic Party, which had held the country together through compromise for decades, fractured over Kansas. Northern and Southern Democrats couldn't even agree on a platform. The election became sectional. Lincoln strong in the North, Breckinridge in the Deep South, Douglas and Bell splitting border states. Lincoln won without a single Southern state. He wasn't even on the ballot in most of the South. Electoral College. Lincoln 180, Breckinridge 72, Bell 39, Douglas 12. Popular vote. Lincoln got only 40%. But in the electoral system, that was enough. Lincoln's victory meant, to the South, that a black Republican abolitionist would control federal power. Never mind that Lincoln had promised not to interfere with slavery where it existed. The South didn't believe him. They believed John Brown represented the North's true intentions. Lincoln was just the political face of Northern aggression. On December 20, 1860, 6 weeks after Lincoln's election, 3 months before his inauguration, South Carolina seceded from the United States. The secession document cited Bleeding Kansas explicitly. It complained about Northern states sending armed settlers to Kansas to exclude the South from the common territory. Kansas had proved, South Carolina argued, that the North intended to destroy slavery through any means necessary, legal or violent. By February 1, 1861, 6 more states had seceded: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. They formed the Confederate States of America on February 4, 1861, electing Jefferson Davis president. And on January 29, 1861, in the chaos of disunion, Kansas was finally admitted to the Union as a free state. The fight that had consumed 5 years, killed 200 people, and radicalized a nation was over. Kansas was free, but there was barely a Union left to join. 4 more states, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, waited to see what Lincoln would do. Border states, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, were paralyzed, trying to stay neutral. So Lincoln took office on March 4, 1861, with a divided country and seceded states seizing federal property across the South. The question was Fort Sumter, a federal fort in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, surrounded by Confederate forces. Lincoln faced an impossible choice: resupply the fort, provoking war, or abandon it, accepting secession. He chose resupply. On April 12, 1861, Confederate artillery opened fire on Fort Sumter. The Civil War had begun, but it had really begun 7 years earlier in Kansas. The tactics used in the Civil War: guerrilla warfare, raids on civilian targets, scorched earth policies, terrorism, all were pioneered in Bleeding Kansas. The guerrilla fighters who terrorized Missouri and Kansas during the war, William Quantrill, the James brothers, the Younger brothers, were all products of Bleeding Kansas violence. The hatreds that made Civil War soldiers fight with unusual viciousness. Kansas taught them to see the other side as irredeemable evil. The collapse of compromise. Kansas proved it was impossible. Even the men who led both sides had Kansas connections. Abraham Lincoln debated Stephen Douglas in 1858, specifically about Kansas and popular sovereignty. Those debates made Lincoln a national figure. Robert E. Lee's first combat command was capturing John Brown at Harper's Ferry, a direct result of Kansas radicalization. The question historians debate: was the Civil War inevitable, or did Bleeding Kansas make it inevitable? The answer is both. The fundamental conflict, slavery in a nation claiming to value freedom, was irreconcilable. Eventually it had to be resolved, but Kansas determined how and when. By turning the slavery question into a violent territorial struggle, the Kansas-Nebraska Act guaranteed that compromise would fail. It turned abstract political disagreement into personal, bloody warfare. By allowing both sides to practice guerrilla violence and terrorism, Kansas normalized political murder. By dragging on for 5 years, Kansas gave both North and South time to radicalize, to choose sides, to prepare for a larger war. Without Bleeding Kansas, maybe secession could have been negotiated. Maybe border states could have mediated. Maybe cooler heads would have prevailed. With Bleeding Kansas, 200 bodies proved that violence worked and compromise didn't. John Brown's final prophecy, that the nation's crimes would be purged only with blood, came true. 620,000 Americans died in the Civil War. Another 400,000 were wounded. Entire cities burned. Families destroyed. A generation traumatized. All to answer the question Kansas couldn't resolve: could a nation survive half slave and half free? The answer was no, it couldn't, and it didn't. The nation that emerged from the Civil War was different. Slavery abolished, federal power centralized, the old Union did. But it began dying in Kansas, in the small towns and prairies where neighbors murdered neighbors over an idea, where democracy failed and rifles spoke, where the fuse was lit and America burned.